Welcome to the Commerce Tomorrow podcast, your one stop to learn about the technology that's powering the future of commerce. Here are your hosts, Dirk and Kelly.
Welcome to another episode of the Commerce Tomorrow podcast. Unfortunately, Dirk is unable to join us. I am joined here today live and in person with Corey Tollefson, who is Global GM for Fashion, Apparel, and Retail of Infor. Welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate being here. Thanks for inviting me.
So what does that title mean? Explain a little bit about your role.
Yeah, so titles. I guess my title is General Manager, Senior Vice President. I run our global business for Infor's retail, fashion, apparel business. And it seems like a mouthful, but when we started this journey, when I came over from Oracle back in 2014, is we were focusing traditionally on retail. So, looking at department stores and grocers, and we still service those types of customers, but a lot of our energy and effort is towards working at those branded manufacturers like Louis Vuitton and Hermes and Louis Vuitton. Like those are some of our key customers as well that do everything from manufacturing to marketing, distribution, to owning their own stores and owning their own direct channels as well.
Okay. And how did you get to Infor? So I know you came from Oracle and we overlapped there a little bit, but what has been your career path to date?
It's been a long journey and it's been an interesting one. I've had a fun ride. Started back in early 2000 working as a Andersen consultant, working on this really small startup that no one had heard of. And I was so disappointed at the time because I thought I'd change the world as some big business consultant executive for a Best Buy. But I worked for this lowly little startup called Retech, and it turns out it was the best decision in a situation I was ever part of. Retech at the time was the market leader in terms of what I'd just call it retail ERP.
So, yeah, it was famous back then.
Yeah, I mean, back in the mid 90s, late 90s in Minneapolis, there was only two real predominant startups in town, one of which was Lawson Software, which was since acquired by my company that I work for now, Infor, as well as then Retech, which was acquired in 2005 by Oracle. So it's just kind of funny to see how that happened. But after Andersen Consulting, I did a short stint working in IT at a company called SuperValue. It was a large grocer here in the Twin Cities. But then I yearned to go back to that startup called Retech. So I worked for Retech, and I affectionately tell Charles Phillips to this day that I was a gift of purchase from the acquisition because I was just a lowly developer, but took on a variety of roles at Oracle, including sales, product management, and upon leaving there, I ran global strategy for Oracle's retail vertical.
Okay. I guess before we get too far into Infor, can you walk us through the history of Oracle Retail, right? That was, and I think still is, a fairly large business unit within Oracle. So how did it get assembled? What are its major pieces? It'd be great to get some history on that.
Yeah, I don't get that question much anymore. So I don't have the history over the last 5 years since I've been at Infor, but those were good times, and I have nothing but respect for what those guys do, and I feel pretty lucky and proud of being part of the original crew that helped found that business unit. So, my experience again in Oracle Retail, it stems from the Retech days, which was, the first acquisition that Oracle made to get into verticals was Retech. If you go back in your time to 2005, Oracle just made an acquisition of PeopleSoft, which PeopleSoft acquired JD Edwards, I think literally the day before. And so Oracle wanted to diversify outside of the database business. So they elected to go forward with ERP, which was PeopleSoft. And Charles had, I don't know what consultancy he employed, but his thesis was to really be relevant as a applications provider, you had to get deep into industries. And so retail was a petri dish. So the first acquisition that he made was Retech. My mentor became the head of that unit. His name is Duncan Angove. Duncan became the general manager, and he basically locked himself in a room with a whiteboard and a pen and said, these are the other acquisitions that we need to make to be really relevant in retail technology. And he went on a buying spree with Larry Ellison, and they went out and they bought Profit Logic. They bought a company called 360 Commerce. They bought a visual space planning company called AVT. And then over time, that culminated in acquisitions, including ATG, which I believe was back in the fall of 2009, something like that.
Yeah, I think it was about that date, yeah.
I think it was the last acquisition Duncan made before he joined Charles and left for Infor. And then shortly thereafter, we made an acquisition of a company called Endeca, which was around search engine optimization, things like that. So there was a nice period of time where we were the de facto standard for some of the latest and greatest technology. But like anything in the industry, 12 months is a long time in the software industry. In dog years, it's like 7 years in the tech industry, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
that was my history. And again, it was great at the time. And I just elected to do something different.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that one. So the reason we were interested in talking with you about Infor is Infor does not have a customer-facing role necessarily, but when a commerce platform submits an order, oftentimes the back end is Infor in some way, right? It's very adjacent to commerce, or it actually handles the core transaction, but it's not the customer-facing piece. What does Infor have in terms of technology around retail and commerce specifically?
Well, let me give you the slight infomercial. So sleight of hand, I'm going to take a side adjacent approach here. So first of all, Infor today is different than Infor was 10 years ago. And the Infor of 10 years ago is much different than the culmination of all the acquisitions that Infor made pre-2010. Okay. So in 2010, I would effectively say Infor 2.0 sprung. And it was comprised of Charles Phillips, the former president of Oracle, came over to Infor with a handful of his top lieutenants. And then, of course, over time, some of his top lieutenants brought over their top lieutenants, people like me. And we just wanted to go after the business applications in a much different way. And if you go back to 2010, everything was about engineered stacks. You know, SAP was making acquisitions around database providers. Everything became around HANA, everything integrated. And then if you go back to Oracle, it was all about engineered systems. Sun Microsystems closed, I think, a year before that in the 2008, 2009 timeframe. And Charles and the thesis that we had was we didn't think businesses cared about database. We didn't think they cared about middleware. We didn't think they cared about any plumbing. All they wanted was the magic of a URL on a public website. And so that became our thesis, which was how do we create business applications that matter to companies? The second design principle we had was how do we take advantage of the power and scale of the internet, and how do we take advantage of a cost infrastructure that should, over time, decrease? And when costs decrease for us, our margin should expand. So we made the strategic bet to go with AWS, which at the time was like a nuclear arms race, was outspending everybody combined, Google, Microsoft, et cetera, right? So we hitched our wagon with AWS, and we'll get into that, how that impacts retail in a little bit. But that was our second design principle, was a public cloud. The third design principle was we wanted to lead with machine learning and lead with as much science as possible, because ERP is a very old, antiquated determination, or three letters. When you think of ERP of yesteryear, it's you set up a business process once, you never touch it again, and it discrete manufacturing, process manufacturing. But in industries like retail or hospitality or healthcare, business models change all the time. So people ask me, like, hey, Kelly, is Walgreens a retailer or a healthcare provider? You ask Walgreens, they're not a retailer. They'll say that they provide health and wellness. So a lot of the business models are being disruptive, and there's convergence going on all across the board. So we thought about that, and that was one of our design principles, was to leverage as much science as possible, because we knew a lot of the business models were changing. The other aspect of this was really around usability. So Charles looked at it and said, has anybody ever created an Apple-like company for business applications? Because frankly, a lot of business applications suck, right?
Yeah, they do.
They do. So we created a team on day one back in 2010 called Hook and Loop. It was really a team of 2 people. I don't know how big we are today. It changes all the time, but it's at least 500 people in New York City that predominantly work on next generation user experience. And we could get into the argument of, well, what's the next gen UI? And next gen UI is really voice. And so a lot of our people come from the Fashion Institute of Technology. And if they weren't working at Infor and the Hook and Loop team, they'd work for Foursquare or Google or Facebook. It's that type of caliber of people. And they gravitate towards Infor because they're like, this industry is so screwed up. because no one for the last 25 years has put usability at the center of anything. And so that's what we've been doing. We have a lab, we affectionately call it the Garage in Manhattan, where we bring in a lot of customers, we spend time understanding their business, and before we write or deploy a single line of code, we do our best to understand what are they trying to change and how that change would impact their business.
And I like that approach. It wasn't too long ago that IT was in charge of buying these big SaaS applications, and they would look at feature function. They'd put out these huge 1,000-question RFPs. Right, the one that ticks all the boxes would get it, but the business user tooling would just be terrible, and it would limit the effectiveness of the software once installed, because who could work with it, right? I mean, there are manuals of how to deal with certain forms, and they're just, no.
The irony of what you just said there around ticking the box is, by definition, ERP means you do just good enough to click the box. Yeah. Hence the reason why in the 90s, everything came up around this concept of best of breed, yep, which created best of breed around Retech for merchandising, best of breed around ATG for front-end e-commerce capture, best of breed around search, which was Endeca. So best of breed came all this, but one of the things I've been talking about for a long time is it also created a lot of pollution. Best of breed point solution pollution, where now you can't get all of these applications to talk to each other, right? So to go back to your original question, so what does Infor do and how do we do it in e-commerce? So back in 2014, we had the idea to sit down in a whiteboard, in a room and whiteboard out, if we were going to do a next generation retail technology company within Infor, what would it look like? And the first thing we stepped with wasn't product set. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit different. You might be surprised when I tell you this. It wasn't product set. It wasn't customer set. It was what kind of culture do we want to create? Because you can fix products, you can create products, but you can't, very seldom can you create a culture that you want to align to. And so Charles gave us the flexibility to say, what kind of culture do you guys want to be? So that permeates into everything we do. Basically, we wanted to engage our customers differently. We wanted to deploy our software differently for our customers. We wanted to charge our customers differently. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the things we do is we put fees at risk based upon successful criteria. I mean, that's unheard of in the industry. And, there's so much low-hanging fruit. One of the things that we did as a decision point was we decided to have one person be responsibility for an entire referenceability and P&L of a customer. And so, for example, if there's a customer in Minneapolis, let's just say Best Buy, there's one person that owns that A to Z to make sure they're successful on any program that they deploy. You compare and contrast that to legacy apps companies, whether it's IBM or Oracle or SAP, they've got 15 to 20 people right. calling on them.
It's a busload of people every meeting.
It's a busload of people, and we try to minimize it to 3 people or less when we engage our customers. But little nuances like that matter to us, and typically what happens is when, first of all, customers don't know who we are. The Infor brand is something that we need to improve upon. It's one of the reasons why we're trying to do some more high visibility things. You may have seen recently Charles was on CNBC talking about potentially doing an IPO. Like, all those things are on the table to give us better brand awareness. But when customers actually invite us to see them and engage with them, they like what they see and they like the way that we work together.
Yeah. And how many people work at Infor today?
There's 17,000. 17,000 employees. I think it's been publicly disclosed we're roughly, between $10 and $12 billion valuation. So we're not quite as big as the upper echelon tier 1, but we're not mid-market either. So we can kind of play in both worlds. Yeah.
It almost sounds like you're a more verticalized sales force. Is that a fair comparison?
Yeah, we are very verticalized. We believe in micro verticals, and the way that we're organized is specifically for retail is everything is specific to the industry. Yeah, that's correct.
So retailers are very notorious for having antiquated IT and not really making the investments necessary. And I think a lot of folks might have an innovation lab, for example, that does flashy next generation things. But if you look at the core point of sale, if you look at all of the back office of retail, it's still really, really antiquated. And I've seen really cool startups like Tulip, for example, like New Store, and they've really tried to revolutionize point of sale. It just doesn't happen. Why? First, am I wrong? And second, if I'm not wrong, why are retailers among the slowest to make these big changes?
Well, let's pick on the example, let's articulate the example that you just used around front-end POS. you can put as much lipstick on that pig as you want to have a better usability, user experience in the store. But again, a lot of the information requires good plumbing to make it work. That means good integration between a register engine back into your back office supply chain systems, your inventory management system. So just because you have a cute front end and something to gamify a user experience, which, by the way, we have all that technology too. I'm not saying that that's not important, but you have to have a platform and a baseline. It's like building a house, and the house is really sexy. It's got all these windows, but it's on a bad foundation. It can't do what it's supposed to do. So for us, our perspective is when we meet retailers, we don't make the assumption that we're a be-all, end-all, where you've got to deploy everything to get the benefit. So our architecture is loosely coupled. We have something called Infor OS, which is built upon industry standards that are open source. It's very lightweight type middleware. It allows us to talk to third parties and use open APIs. And the other aspect of it is it's built on some of the technology that Amazon's running globally for AWS. So as a preferred partner, we get early access to a lot of the products that they have and technologies, so we can use those to provide better services to our clients.
So that covers the vendor side, but from within a retail organization, why are retailers themselves so unwilling? Even if there's a better mousetrap there, they still don't. There's clear demonstrated ROI. Yeah. Many of them still won't touch it.
Well, so great for bringing that back up. So one of the ways that we engage our retailers is we come in with a point of view called value engineering. So we have a team of MBA people, former CFOs, that come in to meet with CFOs of retailers and say, okay, let's do value targeting. These are all the different areas of your business. Sure, we could spend, I'll make this up, $10 million over the next 2 years trying to fix this business process of yours. But if the return isn't until years 3, 4, and 5, you have a lot of risk to do that project. Why would you do it? And so we're constantly looking for target levers to be able to impact on here's what you can deploy and when, and it's a lower risk profile, higher ROI. A lot of retailers are apprehensive to do any project that doesn't impact the in-store experience or allow better margin expansion through better pricing vehicle or better demand. And so we're uniquely set up at Infor because we have next generation thinking around in-store experience, around POS in the cloud, but we also have what we believe is the market leader around machine learning based forecasting and pricing algorithms that allow us to impact the biggest areas of targets for retailers. But holistic end-to-end, hey, let's replace our HCM solution and let's do financials. We do that too, but we just don't see as many of those projects.
Yeah, that sounds fair. I'm just, working with a lot of these retailers, I'm still in shock of how, say, backward some of them are. I think they know what they need to do, they just can't, because it takes so much political will, it takes so much money. And I think there's always somebody out there who, if they put their neck on the line and they advocate for a big change and it doesn't work, they get fired and have to move with their family. And nobody wants to have kids in school and have to move to another city for another job.
Well, I think one of the low-hanging fruit, you were kind of alluding to it probably 2 or 3 questions ago, which is there's this concept of front-end e-commerce. And a lot of the legacy providers are being replaced by companies like yourself with microservices. You still need a back office system. And in the case of Infor, we're the de facto standard for the fashion apparel industry, where if somebody makes an order, like hypothetically speaking, on like a Nike.com, that's using a front-end proprietary order capture system, but the actual fulfillment of that order is on our network. And so it was an acquisition we made a few years back called GT Nexus. We've just recently rebranded it Infor Nexus. At any point in time, we have over 97% of the world's ocean freight in real-time visibility. So we have a concept of a control tower. So you can log into our software, and at any point in time, you can see 97% of your goods and services, or your goods that are being delivered overseas from China, in real-time visibility. So here's where the use case gets really interesting. I mentioned we have the market-leading technology around machine learning and forecasting. What if, using that control tower, you can see that based upon trends in the northwest part of the country, For whatever reason, that style, that color, that class of that, I'm looking at your sweater right now, that's sold out. And so in Southern California, there's excess supply. So what happens is when it hits Oakland to be taken off the boat or the ocean carrier, we'll just change the transportation endpoint of that and move it up into the Northwest. So it's the ability to shape and shift demand and replenishment, which we think is next generation thinking around supply chain.
It's very fascinating. It's really funny how you say front end meaning the OMS. I mean, to us in the commerce platform space, that's the back end of us. It's just a different,
a different mindset,
different perspective.
Yeah, different perspective.
So we've seen a shift between best of breed and suite, right? And it seems to go back and forth every 5 or 10 years. Long term, where do you think things are going to end up in that regard?
Well, I think long term, everything flips constantly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, back in the 80s, it was you bought hardware that had some software on it.
Right.
And then all of a sudden in the late 90s, it became interoperability, interoperability using client server databases. Then 2000 to 2005, everything's about the web. And then suddenly between 2005 and 2010, it flipped over to engineered stacks again. I mean, The funny thing is the technology vendors can do everything at its disposal to try to shape and shift like trends and how people procure software. The reality is no one truly knows. I guess if, from my vantage point, I think what's going to be the next shoe to drop, so to speak, is the technologies we use for consumer apps and enterprise apps. There should be some convergence there. Mm-hmm. There's no reason why you should use a beautiful, I'll say a beautiful application or an engaging experience, whether it's a Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and then you got to go to work and use this really shitty looking software. Like those days, I think, are coming to an end.
Well, and I see that in our expense reporting. We were on Concur, which was bought by SAP.
Yep.
And that is the worst single application to use ever, right? And that's a very corporate app. And then we switched over to Expensify, and we just love it. It's a very consumer experience. And I don't mind doing expenses anymore because it's such a nice experience.
That's the irony. So typically when I do interviews like this, Kelly, one of the questions I get is, who's your biggest competitor? And people kind of give me a weird side-eye glance when I say, it's the technology company that hasn't been invented yet. Yeah. Like, I don't go to bed at night worried about Oracle or SAP or JDA. I don't care about any of them, to be honest. What I care about is some guy in a garage who's going to, totally disrupt an entire category. Because the technology that, it's beautiful being in the year, effectively we're in 2020 now. Mm-hmm. And what's gorgeous about being in this time frame of life is the walls or barriers to create a successful software company have shrunk to be non-existent.
Right.
As compared to 2000, as compared to 1990.
Right. If this was 2000, you'd have to get a bunch of money, go buy some sun boxes, hire some admins. Right, and that just gets you to the point of having an operating system, yet alone any software on top of that.
Yep, the old Wintel model, get a bunch of hardware, servers, database, middleware, and fiber optics weren't laid down over to India yet. You couldn't get less expensive offshore labor, and
right.
Yeah.
And even in our space, we now see the front end. The front end to us, meaning the actual JavaScript, HTML.
Yeah.
We now see these front end as a service stacks where you don't even really have to develop much software. They just do it for you. So yeah, it's a remarkable time to be alive, isn't it?
It is.
So a few years ago, we saw many retailers talking about cloud being too risky. And even when I started at Commerce Tools in 2016, I spent 6 months talking to customers and prospects. They said, we don't want our sensitive data in the cloud, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you dealt with that even worse than we did. But it seems 2017-ish, I was never asked that question again. Why was that such a big deal for them, given every other aspect of their lives is in a public cloud somewhere already, even back then? Why are retailers specifically, why were they so hesitant to this? And what flipped, I guess?
Well, I'll give one use case where perhaps this will lead us to the conclusion of why it flipped. But one use case that I dealt with about 5 years ago was, ID, security, in-store breaches, things of that nature. And companies like a Target would say, hey, we're spending X amount of millions. We can we can take responsibility and accountability for securing the data and information that's sensitive to our customers, whether it's credit card, employee information, all that, right? And what happened is after a few breaches, they were exposed and said, oh God, well, maybe we aren't spending enough money and have the right talent to ensure that we won't get hacked. As in comparison to a software vendor, we spend so much money on making sure people's data is secure because, like the insurance industry, if somebody never paid out a claim, the whole business model falls apart. Right. As a SaaS solution provider, if we are exposed or if our customers' data is exposed, our entire business model is exposed. And that's one of the benefits of partnering with a public cloud provider is they, in turn, spend way more money than any other technology company would spend to ensure the data is available or the data is walled off and is ensured, is secure.
Yeah.
So.
No, and I agree. And I always used to tell customers that the AWSs of the world, they go out and hire $1 million a year security architects, right? They hire all the PhDs and they do it at scale. And to this date, I don't think there's ever been a public cloud security. Have you heard of?
Nope, I haven't heard any. I haven't heard any, and I know.
Knock on wood here.
Knock on wood, but I think they call them ethical hacking, and I know for a fact that they throughout the day are ethically hacking all of our solutions because sometimes if there's some sort of like potential, hey, we saw something that you need to look at, we make a prompt change as soon as possible. So
yeah, we do that too. And what's crazy, if you look at the security certifications list that these public clouds have, it's 100 different ones, right? I mean, every single conceivable certification they have, and they do it at scale. They do it really well. It's their business. I think it's foolish for folks to think that they can outwit Google or Amazon and try to do it in their data center any more secure. So we see and hear a lot about digital transformation these days. What does that mean to you, and how do you know if you've arrived?
Well, so digital transformation for me feels like a polluted word, so to speak, over the last few years. So when we first started talking about digital transformations, we were talking about, I mentioned earlier, we have a value engineering team. We also have a digital transformation team. And a lot of these people that are part of this team they're not even from the tech industry. They came from the ad agency companies. They came from change management organizations. And we'd come in, we'd meet a lot of customer executives or prospective executives, and we'd say, what do you want your company, what is the soundbite 3 years from now if you're in Fortune magazine? And then we look at the CIO and say, if you were the soundbite for Wired magazine, what's it going to say about you and what you deliver? What is the legacy that you're leaving? Which then over time became our tagline for retail and fashion technology, which is leave your legacy. And it's a double entendre around leave your legacy, meaning leave your legacy software solutions, but also we're only here for a finite amount of time on this planet. Why don't we leave a legacy? Yeah. And so that's our message and one of our core values across our organization. But as it pertains to digital transformation, I feel like that term has been polluted to the point where ERP providers consider digital transformation anything that takes a customer from pen and paper and a legacy ERP on-premise into a cloud environment. But for us, digital transformation means much more than that, because there are certain things that, back in the day, a lot of technology vendors didn't really provide creative services around their applications. They'd say, well, go talk to Accenture, go talk to IBM, Razorfish. Those guys kind of do the creative aspect of it. Mm-hmm. But what we talk about is we can come in almost like a McKinsey and say, here's what's wrong with your company together. And here's what we would do to improve your company. And here's how we could be prescriptive to improve your company. And oh, by the way, not just that upfront business case work or results measurement, 12 months later, we actually have the software to help you get there. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be a gap. There's always going to be a gap in the industry between software that's generally available today versus stuff that's forward thinking. And so in some cases, we're willing to round off some of our solutions, last mile features, functions with good strategic partners that can help us co-innovate together.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Do you have any good case studies, any organizations who you've worked with to make this transition?
Yeah, there's lots of them, and it's not just retail specific. They're in lots of different industries. I mean, some of the work that we've done with Walgreens around machine learning is really forward thinking. Really excited about doing that. Sharing that information. I think one of the best aspects of Walgreens is, I mentioned earlier before, machine learning based forecasting now versus back of yesteryear. In yesteryear, if you wanted to run deep algorithms, you'd have to load up a bunch of servers, and hopefully it would run at the performance speed that you need. Mm-hmm. But with our solution, it's built for the cloud from the ground up. So in the example of Walgreens, without getting into too much proprietary information, they have the capability of running our algorithms and getting the data that they need by taking advantage of all the cores within AWS. And when that algorithm is done running, it spits all the cores back out to the rest of the population.
And that's how it should be. That's exactly how software should function.
The number one operating system in the world is the internet. That is the number one operating system. And the more tech companies that can align to building their applications purpose-built for the internet, mm-hmm. the more efficient our industry is going to be.
Yeah, I completely agree. So what's your view of this whole retail apocalypse that folks keep talking about?
Yeah, so we don't really subscribe to retail apocalypse. We've got something called what we believe is the retail reinvention. Like, we're ushering in a new golden age of retail. I think Wayfair this week announced that they're going to get into stores. Andy Dunn's a good friend of mine. He's over at Bonobos. He was the founder of Bonobos. He's now at Walmart.
The famous DNVB.
Yeah. Yeah. And with those guys, it's like they created these great brand image, this great brand experience. And there's ways in which you can go direct to consumer. There's ways in which you can have your product in the store. There's just a whole multifaceted, multi-channel way of creating your own brand and then distributing it in the future. I mean, I've said this 1,000 times, but I'll say it again. The days when we were kids of destination shopping, where we loaded up the family truckster, we went over to, the local Southdale or whatever you want to call it, the local watering hole, having cafe in the cafeteria, like that experience of that mall shopping is dead. And I think a lot of these brands that are surviving, they're actually thriving as they control their own brand image and creating their own stores.
Yeah, it is being completely reinvented, and I think it's a good thing. I have friends who work at JCPenney, but they don't serve a purpose anymore in our economy. We saw Shopko in Wisconsin. They're closing all of their stores. They just filed. It was very bland, undifferentiated retail, and it was a bad assortment. It was a bad experience. It just felt like the concept was dying, if not dead already.
The irony is Amazon.com is the world's largest catalog, and you'll never outsort it. And if you ask Amazon what they are, they're not a retailer. They call themselves a supply chain company.
Yeah.
So they're trying to squeeze out as much inefficiencies out of the supply chain as possible to provide the lowest price point, and they want to have access to everything. It's like the endless aisle is Amazon. So how do you combat that? By having better experiences. Yeah. And experiences need to be consistent, whether it's in the store or online. And the retailers that provide that experience are going to win. And what we've found is a lot of these brands are becoming retail-centric. So they're moving from just simply creating their product and then shipping it to JCPenney or Kohl's. They're like, I want to control my own brand image. So these great brands that I'm creating and cultivating, and also taking advantage of social media tools, whether it's Instagram or Snap or all these others, mm-hmm. and then having their own stores to control their own identity and their own message. That's the next gen that's going to do well.
And I'm a huge personal fan of DNVBs. I think it's great. I actually go to Andy Dunn's, he has that Medium post of an encyclopedia of DNVBs.
Yeah.
And if I'm looking for something, I'll actually usually start there because the experience is so much better.
Yeah.
Than going into some boring retailer, or I'll just go to Amazon.
Yeah. Well, we want to minimize the going to Amazon because there's still great retailers out there.
Yeah. So what is, in your world, the commerce platform, the order capture system is at the very top of the funnel for you. What is your visibility into that space, and what are you seeing right now?
Yeah, so go back to, I think the first question you asked me was around how did this kind of come together? So after we came out and decided upon the type of culture we wanted to have, we also wanted to talk about what are the design principles. So any modern retail technology company would put OMS, or distributed order orchestration, at the core of what it does. And so we started back in early 2015, I think it was January, February 2015, creating a next generation OMS system. And what we found is it's really hard because it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and we were getting impatient. So we went out to the market and we found that there was this hidden jewel out of Germany called Arvado. And what Arvado was a team that, if you asked them, they were very good at consulting and deployments and delivery. And they were an offshoot of Hybris back in the day. But they weren't good at packaging up as a product and selling it. And that's one thing that we're pretty good at. And so we made the acquisition of that company about 12 months ago. It fueled and accelerated our roadmap faster and quicker. And the center of the universe for our supply chain systems is really around what we call INOM, which stands for our network order management, but it's networked. So whereas a JDA or a Manhattan can propose an OMS system that's not integrated to, it might be integrated to a warehouse management, for example, our order management is integrated not only to our warehouse package, not only is it integrated to our machine learning-based forecast, it's integrated onto our network. And so the ability to have access and timely information around not just what you've ordered and where, it's the whole aspect of where it is in the supply chain that feeds its way into order orchestration.
Very interesting. Well, I think that's the end of our time today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Appreciate it. Happy to be here and looking forward to doing it again sometime.
Thanks.